Hello and welcome back. In this video, we are going to finish the main part of the video, which basically means we have to work more with the layout, do scene transitions, and then figure out how to send data across various scenes in Godot. I suppose let's jump right in and explain the problem. The main scene we are working in is the level, so level.scene has most of the things we need to work with. However, besides that, for example, if the player gets hit, we want to update things in the UI, which is a completely separate scene. On top of that, when the player runs out of health, then we want to go to the game over screen, and if the player presses space in there, we want to go back to the level. Also, we want to keep a score and send this score to the game over screen once the game is over. Which means overall, this part is going to be a lot about sending data across various scenes and loading other scenes from one scene, which is also super useful and quite easily done. Although, first of all, let's start working on the UI, where we have actual health indicators. So at the moment, we simply have 5 health icons because in the UI, we have added 5 texture rectangles. Good start, but not ideal. For that, instead, I want to work in the level script. And then give me a bit more space. To make all of this work, I want to have some method to check the collision between a meteor and the player. That is already the first problem, because at the moment, when we are creating a meteor, we, have a meteor. But so far, every time we added a signal, we did it manually via the inspector. So for example, for the player, here you could select all of the signals. But that we cannot do for the meteors because they are created in code and we couldn't add them manually anymore. To fix that, we first of all want to work inside of the meteor. In there, we need to work with another signal. So let me open up the meteor and go to node and signals. So we already have a body entered, which is the method we created a while back, and that doesn't do very much. It simply prints the body and body entered. That we don't want anymore. Instead, we want to emit another signal, meaning all the way at the top, we want to create a signal, let's call it collision. And this signal we want to emit, i.e. collision.emit, without any parameters. That way we know if a body has entered. But this we now cannot use right away, because we cannot manually add a signal to all of this because it's created via code. So we have to add all of this via code as well. Let's call it connect the signal. All we want to do is get the node we created, Meteor, and then connect. Now we need 2 arguments. The first one is the signal we want to capture, which in our case is called collision. The one we just created, this one here. After that, we have to run some kind of method. I call that one on_meteor_collision. Now Godot is going to complain that this method does not exist. So let's create it right below with func on meteor collision without any parameters. And in there, we can simply print meteor collision in level. And now I can run all of this and we should still get a collision on meteor collision in level. This is working pretty well. Cool. And just to go through what happened. Inside of the meteor, we have an inbuilt signal on body entered, which is triggered every time a body is entering this area 2D. That part should still be fairly easy. After that, we are emitting a signal that we have called collision. And this is a custom signal, very similar compared to what we have done for the player. So if you look at the player code, there we have signal laser. And this we are capturing inside of the level. If you go to the player, there we have a laser. Or a laser signal to be a bit more specific. And for the meteors, we want to connect a similar thing, except for those, we can't do it because we are generating all of the meteors via code. As a consequence, we also have to attach the signal via code because we couldn't do it manually anymore. After that, we are getting an on meteor collision, and that's all we really need. Also, there should be an underscore at the beginning to keep the naming a bit more consistent. So on meteor collision with lots of underscores. With that, we have a signal that tells us if the player and the meteor collide. If that is the case, I want to update the health of the player. And for that, inside of the level, I want to have var health, which should be an integer. And let's say the health of the player at the start is going to be 3. a completely random number. Just choose whatever you like in here. Okay, now after that, when we have a collision between the player and the meteor, we want to reduce this amount. So health minus equal 1. On top of that, if health is below 0, or let's say below or equal to 0, then we want to go to the game over screen. But for now, let's simply print that. Also, just to make sure we can see what's going on, I want to print the health. So let's try all of this. If I collide with Meteor, we get 2, 1, and if I collide again, 0, dead. Cool, this is working. But obviously, we don't just want to print health or dead, we want to actually update the UI. But now we have another problem. UI is in a different scene. We are currently in the level, and we have to update the UI. Now, you could get the UI and then run a method on it. That would work, but not what I want to do, because sometimes the UI is quite far away from the code you are running. Instead, there's a better way to globally get to a certain kind of scene. And that is something we haven't seen yet, groups. You can place any node inside of a group and then get them globally, i.e. anywhere inside of the game, which is incredibly powerful. You see it fairly often that you have a group with a single node, and you have this set up to simply target this specific node anywhere inside of the script. The player really often is in a group called player as well, simply to get the player immediately from literally anywhere. So in this case, I want to create a group called UI and then add it. And now you can see in the scene tree that we have this symbol. That means the node is inside of a group. That allows us to capture it anywhere inside of the code. So at the moment, we are working inside of level.gd, the code attached to the level scene. So at the moment, we are in level. But I want to get to UI. For that, I can get the scene tree and then call a group. This one wants to first of all get the name of the group. In my case, this is called UI. After that, it wants to have a name of the method I want to call. After that, we want to have a string with the name of the method we want to call. I'm going to call this one setHealth. It doesn't exist right now, but we can create it in just a second. And after that, you can see some dots in the hint. You can add extra arguments. In my case, I want to have the amount of health. Whatever you specify in there is going to be passed into the function as an argument. So with that, let me exit the code screen, go to UI, and in there, I want to attach a script to the UI, which we can store in the usual way, and we can have an empty script. We want to create a function called setHealth, which needs to have one parameter, the amount of health. I suppose we can simply call it amount. That feels a bit better. And in there, for now, I simply want to print the amount. And just to make sure we are in the UI, I also want to print UI. So what is going to happen now is that inside of the level, we are calling the group UI and call the setHealth method for all of them, while passing the health information into it. Since our UI group only has a single node attached, we are only going to run this setHealth once. But let's try it first of all. If I now collide with a meteor, we get 2, 1, and 0 UI. So we are calling this information. It worked pretty well. And that's basically all you really have to know about groups. They are ultimately fairly simple, and you can attach one node to a single or to multiple groups. And that's basically it. It doesn't get that much more complicated, but it's incredibly useful. But anyway, now we have to figure out how to actually make this setHealth work to update the UI. At the moment, we have 5 texture rectangles in there, and this I don't really like. Here's what we are going to do instead. First of all, whenever we are updating the health, so we are setting the health, we are first going to remove all children from the HBox container. Let's simply say remove all children. And after that, we're going to create new children, and the amount is set by health. I.e., if we have a health of 2, we're going to create 2 texture rectangles with the particular texture. With that system, we always get the right amount of health that corresponds to the amount of health that the player has in the level. Although to implement all of that, we need a couple of things. First of all, we have to remove all of the children. That part is fairly easy. We want to get the margin container and then use a for loop. So for child in margin container and then get underscore children. Don't forget to call this one. And after you have done it. To delete a node, all you need is Q3. This one deletes a node. Since we are calling setHealth every time we are colliding with a meteor, if we are now colliding with a meteor in the game, all of the health icons should disappear. And they do. That looks pretty good. So next up, we have to recreate them, which is going to be another for loop. Let's say for I in amount. And if you come from Python, this is going to look a bit weird because in Python, you always need the ranged function to actually loop over an integer. In Godot or JavaScript, you don't need that at all, which makes things a bit easier. We want to create an entirely new node. Although you could also create a separate scene with the health texture and then spawn that, but we don't really need that. Instead, I want to create a texture rectangle. And to create a node entirely from scratch, all you really need is texture rectangle, so the name of the node, and then the new keyword. That way, you are creating a new node. Another way to think about it would be that this is somewhat similar compared to instantiate, where you are taking a blueprint and then create a node from that, except now we have an inbuilt blueprint. Next up then, we have to get this texture rectangle and assign a texture to it. This we're getting via load. And now we have to load the one image. I think I called it player live 1 red. Fairly long path, but the Godot hints here work really well. However, this system is a bit inefficient because we are loading the same image multiple times for every I in the for loop. A better way of handling this would be to create a variable right at the beginning, which I'm going to call image. And in there, we're going to store what we have loaded. That way, we can reuse it and only load it once. Feels much better. Also, what we can do is turn this image into a static variable, which for this variable is what we want to do. With that, we have a texture rectangle with a texture. All we have to do now is to add it to this margin container, or the hbox container inside of the margin container. So all I want to do is get the hbox container inside of margin container 2 and then add a child, which is going to be the texture rectangle. That is actually all we need. Now I can start all of this again and we should go to the proper amount of health. Although that's a bit hard to see. Let me run all of this again. If I now get hit once by a meteor, we go to 2 texture rectangles, and now we get to 1 and 0. So this is working. Although the scaling is getting a bit weird. And to fix that, look at 1 texture rectangle, and then look at the stretch mode. This is the property we have updated, and we have to set it to keep. If you have our stretch mode, you can see in code, we can target this via stretch mode. I want to get the text rectangle, and then get the stretch mode. And then Godot is giving us all of the hints that we need. We want to get stretch.keep. And that should fix everything. If I now run the game again, that feels much better. Although the one issue we have right now is that by default, we have 5 texture rectangles. To fix that, I want to get rid of all of these texture rectangles and have no child inside of hbox container. The issue with that, though, is that by default now, we don't have any health at the beginning, but once we collide, we have 2 health. Very confusing. That we can fix, though, quite easily. All we have to do is to call this call group another time in the script somewhere, ideally when we are starting the game. So in the ready function, let's call it setup health UI. And we have to call this same method, and that's all we really have to do, because health is what we really want. If I now run all of this again, we can see we have 3 health at the beginning, and this decreases every time we collide with a meteor. Cool. Although now, if we go to negative, we can print death, but nothing else is happening. So that we have to work on next. Basically, all that we want to do is, if the player's health goes below 0, then we want to change the scene to game over. And Godot makes that part really easy. All we have to do is get the scene tree again, and then change scene either to file or to packed. File is what I want to use for this case. And now we have to specify what scene we want to go to. And for that, I want to exit the full screen code view and go to my scenes, because in there we have gameover.tscn. Simply drag this in there, and now we should be going to this scene. If I run the code and get hit by a meteor a couple of times, we get to game over. Cool, that looks pretty good. What we now have to figure out is how to go back to the main game, which should happen on this screen if we are pressing space. That part is going to be your exercise. I want you guys to return to the game if the player presses space. Pause the video now and see if you can figure this one out. Back in Godot, I want to work inside of game over. In there, first of all, we need to have a script, which we can create in the usual way, and we don't need ready, at least for now, and the comment we also don't need anymore. All we really want to check is if the player is pressing space, which in our case is the shoot action. So we can simply go with if input is action, either just pressed or pressed, both would be just fine. I would go with just pressed. And then shoot. If that is the case, I want to do the same thing I've done before. Get the tree and then change scene either to packed or to file. I suppose just to cover both, I want to go to packed. And now Godot wants to have a packed scene, like we have seen before. So for example, in the level, all the way at the top, we have two packed scenes, the Meteor scene and the level scene. The same thing I want to do for the main game scene. So let's call it the var level scene, which has to be a packed scene. And all we need to do to get this one is load it with level.tscn. And this is what we want to pass into this change scene to packed method. Level scene. Let's try. If I now run all of this, I can die. And if I now press space, we are back. This is looking pretty good. And we also have the amount of health at the beginning. So all of this is working pretty good. Cool. Also, what you can do is sometimes you want to select one specific scene to load. And this you can do in the editor via export once again. If I now go to game over, we can select a level scene right in the editor. So if you go to quick load, then you can select all of the scenes in the game. In my case, the level. And the output would still be exactly the same. If I now get hit, there we go. Everything works just as before. Next up then, we have to implement the timer. At the moment in the level, the timer is simply a static number. It's actually in the UI. There we have a label that just doesn't do anything. It's a static number. To make this one more interactive, I want to give the entire scene a timer, which I can call the score timer. And basically, once we are starting this, it is going to trigger once every second, and it keeps on going forever. As a matter of fact, we can simply set auto start to true, and then it's going to start right away with the rest of the game. After that, we can go to signals and connect the signal to the UI on timeout. In there, basically what we want to do is do something like time elapsed and then plus equal 1 every time the timer triggers out. This time elapsed doesn't exist right now. So let's create a variable with time elapsed, and this one should be an integer. I suppose a bit more explicit way of doing this would be semicolon equals 0. That way you know exactly what the start value is, although those two would be equivalent. But anyway, now we have time elapsed, and let's just print what we are getting. Time elapsed. If I now run the game, we should be seeing 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. The score does keep increasing. All we have to figure out now is how to actually show this in the score. That part is fairly easy. All we have to do is get the label inside of the margin container. And on this, we want to update the text, which has to be a string of time elapsed. If I now run this again, after 1 second, we get 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Meaning all that we have to do in the scene, we have to update the default value to a 0. That way, I can run all of this again, and now we get 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. That looks pretty good. With that, we have a working UI. However, there's one more problem, and that is, I do get the UI, but now if I go to the game over screen, the score is always going to be 0. That is because at the moment, we have no way to connect the level health to the game over health. Now you could put game over inside of a group and then work via that. That would be one way to approach it. However, since I want to cover a variety of ways, I want to cover another approach. And that is to use a global script. When I look at the file system in the bottom, I want to create a new folder, which you can do by right-clicking and then create a new folder. You could also create a scene, a script, or something else. I want to create a new folder and call it global. Then Godot is going to do a thing for a second. And then we have a new folder. Sometimes it gets stuck in this view. You just have to save it and then it updates. In there, I now want to create a new script. And this one needs to have a name. I want to call it global. Also, it should be empty by default. If I now create it, I have a new script that I can click on, and all we have is extends node. Node is the most simple node in Godot, and a script is always attached to a node. But this one isn't going to do very much. That's okay though, because in there, we only want to store a single variable. Let's call it the score, which can be 0 by default. Also, I want to make sure that this is always an integer. Now, we have one script, and this script I want to have available in literally every scene. And for that, I can go to Project, Project Settings, and there we have Auto Load. This one automatically loads a script into every single scene. And the way you're using it is, first of all, you select a scene, which in my case is in global and global.gd. Then we have to give it a name, and this is how you would target this kind of script anywhere inside of the game. Global is usually a pretty good name. And now you have to click on Add, and you can also enable or disable it. And this is all you have to do. And basically what happened now, if I run the game and go to the editor and remote, there you can see we have global. And if I go to the game over screen, now in remote you can see we are in game over, but we also still have global, which is really useful because with that system we have the score available everywhere, and we can both change it and read it. Which means inside of the UI, when we are increasing time elapsed, I also want to increase the score. And for that, we want to go to global and then get the score. And simply set this to the time elapsed. After that, inside of the game over script, when this scene is starting, meaning in func_ready, we want to update this score text. And for that, inside of the inspector, I can get rid of the score 0 and simply keep the score, and let's say a semicolon. All we have to do now is get the current text and then add the score at the end. For that, first of all, we have to get the label node. You might want to give it a custom name, but I simply want to get label 2, and then Godot gives me a hint with usually the correct answer. And on there, I want to update the text. And by the way, this text you can both write on and read, which means the proper value for this one could be, and let me expand all of this, the current text, and then plus a string of global.score. And now with that, I can run the entire game. And if I get hit a couple of times, we get a score of 0. If I start out of this again, we start again with 0, and let me survive a few more seconds. If I now die again, we get a score of 4. And this I can do over and over again. It always works in the same way. Perfect. And with that, we have basically all of the game, although there's one part that I did forget to include, and that is the lasers should destroy the meteors. That part though is fairly easy. All we have to do inside of the meteors, there we already have a script. We want to add another signal. And for that, you want to have the meteor selected. We know that the only area we have in the code that can collide with the meteors is going to be the laser, meaning every time an area entered, we know a laser is entered. So I want to connect this signal. And now if that is the case, I first of all want to get the area that has entered and then Q3 it, which means we're going to remove it. And after that, I want to Q3 the meteor as well. That way, we're getting rid both of the laser and of the meteor. Let's try, and let me try to hit a meteor. That looks pretty good. And there we go. Cool, this is working. Finally, the debugger is complaining, and that's never a good sign. And all we get is that on body entered, the body has never been used. So we should be adding an underscore before that. If I now run this again, the debugger seems to be happy. Although let's go to game over, and there we get another debugger problem. So let's check this one out. And then there, we are never using delta in process. And actually, that's a good thing because in there, I want to demonstrate something else. So you could simply add an underscore in there, and that would fix the issue. However, we only want to get input in here, and the process function is a bit of an overkill for that. A better function would be underscore input. And this one gives you the input event. The way you would be using that is very similar compared to what we have done up here. In fact, I do want to copy all of that, and let me go to full screen. All we have to do is change input to event. Although this event is not as powerful as the input class. It, for example, doesn't have isActionJustPressed, but it does have isActionPressed. Meaning with that, we're getting the proper input. That means we can get rid of process, and everything else should work just fine. Also, what you can do, let me go back to the scene. If you simply want to test a single scene, like game over, you can go to this icon at the top and run the current scene, and then we go straight to this particular scene. If I now press space, we're starting the game. And that is looking pretty good. Everything else still works just fine. And with that, we have a proper game. Now, this isn't the end of the series. There's going to be one more video where we are going to add the sound. That one's really important. But on top of that, I'm going to cover some other nodes that could be helpful if you want to go further in Godot. I'll see you there.